So my name is John Scott-Railton. I'm senior researcher at Citizen Lab. This is my colleague Bill Marczak, senior fellow at Citizen Lab. And we're going to give you a presentation today talking about how the spies hacking our phones are going dark. So the roadmap for this is super straightforward. We're going to talk about some players in the spyware industry. We're going to talk about how we hunt them. We're going to give you some information about why we think they're going dark. We're going to talk about the narrowing knowledge pipe of information about these operations. And then we're going to say a few things about what we think you can do. But first, we sort of have to start with a disclaimer, which is when you talk about 0 days and other sort of exotic, sexy, sophisticated attacks, you have to remind yourself that for the most part, most attacks, most of the time, including those targeting high-risk groups, are really boring. They are nevertheless effective. So in a couple of years of looking at all the attacks targeting a number of China-focused groups, we found one O-Day. And I think the analogy that you can keep in your head is that tuberculosis, smallpox, malaria do way outsized harm, but much of the research focus is on exciting things like Ebola. So with that disclaimer, we're going to talk about Ebola. So some players in this industry. Well, these days there's kind of a large surveillance industrial complex. At the top end, you have sort of large-scale data analytics, machine learning, predicting behavior. At the meso level, you have data interception and massive interception. And then kind of at the tip of this upside-down pyramid, you have targeted malware and other kinds of intrusion, which of course is what we get to talk about. The pitch that companies that make this kind of targeted malware say is that criminals and others are going dark and that states need some kind of ability to chase them down their dark hole. They sell this kind of technology at conferences and industry events around the world. And sort of no matter their name, their pitch is basically the same. You've got stuff you want to hack, you have devices you can't monitor, here's a way to get on. And it used to be that if you wanted to do this kind of sophisticated nation-state level targeted stuff, you needed your own STEM program. You needed to develop your own endogenous capability. That is no longer true. Now all you need is a checkbook, right? And all of the major exciting things that we all learned about in 2013 when Snowden did his revelations are now available to anybody for a price. So with that, I want to give a little example of one of these companies and how things go so wrong.
Thanks, John. So one of the companies that we've done a bit of reporting on at Citizen Lab is this company called Cyberbit. They're a division, well, when we did the report at least, these companies are constantly reorganizing. They were a division of Israeli defense contractor Elbit Systems, and you can see here one of their booths at like an ISS World type conference. And what we see with companies like this is, they go off, they do these exhibitions at ISS World, they go and they give demonstrations. In some cases, we were able to identify, them going to like Uzbekistan's National Security Service and other places which are sort of a who's who of repressive governments. And the results are fairly predictable. They sell this technology to a government, and then we, on the Citizen Lab side, start seeing cases of abuse. So here you can see some emails that were received by Ethiopian diaspora activists, and the subjects were sort of enticing them to click on potentially interesting videos. It turns out if they clicked on the links included in the emails, they were directed to this sort of fake video portal that said, hey, before you see this video that's really interesting, you need to update your Flash player. And as I'm sure you can all imagine, if a target clicked there and downloaded and installed the Flash player, their computer would be infected with spyware, in addition to getting an updated Flash player. Predictably, again, this was being used by a repressive government, so of course it was being used to target journalists and dissidents. So some targets we identified in the Oromo community included Jawar Mohammed, who's the head of Oromia Media Foundation, an Ethiopian diaspora media outlet based in the States, as well as some academics. Interestingly, they also sort of targeted me in a very sort of crude way, I think because I was corresponding with some of these targets. But overall, we found around sort of 40 cases here of targeting and abuse. And we were able to quantify these targets, trace them across 5 continents, North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. But John is going to tell us about something that you might have read about in today's Wall Street Journal.
So ripped directly from this morning's headlines, meet a 36-year-old musician in Uganda named Bobby Wine. Bobi Wine is also a Ugandan member of parliament, and observers of Uganda and Ugandans alike think, hey, this guy may represent a credible challenge, a popular voice challenging Uganda's current dictatorial regime. Well, as his star was rising, so too was the Ugandan government's appetite for information about what Mr. Bobi Wine was up to. So, as we learned from today's Wall Street Journal, Bobi Wine was targeted by Ugandan security services using a piece of Israeli-made spyware. And after a week of trying, for whatever reason, they did not succeed. So they basically wandered across the street to a group of Huawei techs who were supporting some of their other interception programs and sat them down in front of their spyware console and says, guys, can you help us out? And they did. And the Ugandan government then successfully managed to infiltrate his phone, gain information about the protests that he was organizing, and arrest him and round up a bunch of his supporters. One can only imagine that as the Huawei techs were sat down in front of that console, they asked if they could plug in a USB. So the takeaway from this is pretty simple. This kind of technology is extremely exciting to all states, and in a context where there's not a lot of oversight, it represents an absolutely impossible to resist temptation for abuse. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we hunt this stuff, and it's basically a kind of a reciprocal process. On the one hand, we spend a lot of time working directly with high-threat individuals and trying to get from them the kinds of things that get us started. Sometimes that means sitting on their networks and monitoring the stuff that comes across them. Sometimes that means working with them to proactively identify suspicious messages. And sometimes that means going back to groups that we think have been targeted in the past and trying to do sort of wholesale searching for suspicious targeting. On the flip side, we do a series of technical things, including fingerprinting, infrastructure analysis, and DNS cache probing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who's going to talk to you about one such case.
Thanks, John. So if you have been following this sort of industry and news articles for a while, you might have been familiar with this case of Ahmed Mansour, an activist in the UAE, or I should say former activist, now serving 10 years in prison for sending out tweets that criticize the UAE's involvement in Yemen. So in August 2016, he received perhaps, I don't know, not sure if I should say these are like the most famous text messages ever, but perhaps pretty close. He received these text messages warning or purporting to provide information about new secrets of Emiratis tortured in state prisons. Kind of odd to get this sort of text from an unknown number, as you can see here, but that's exactly what he got. And he thought the link looked a bit dodgy, so he forwarded it to us for analysis. And of course, when you get one of these things, especially if it contains a link. These companies that provide this sort of spyware are very cognizant that security researchers like us are trying to figure out what they're up to and trying to get juicy stuff from targeting. So of course, these links are very closely, tightly held and very strongly limited, so that if you click on it once, you might get something interesting, but the second click, you don't get anything, or they might be time limited. 24 hours after it's sent out, it might get disabled. So of course, we clicked on it, man in the middling our traffic so we could intercept anything that was downloaded to the phone. And of course, what we got is a chain of 3 zero-day exploits for the latest version of the iPhone, which Apple did not know about, which enabled the installation of a persistent backdoor that could access virtually everything on the phone, which we were able to trace back to NSO Group, an Israeli spyware vendor. And of course, as part of this process, we worked with Apple, disclosed the exploits to them. They issued a patch very quickly to patch and render these vulnerabilities useless for installing spyware in the future. But of course, the story doesn't end there. Companies like NSO Group have hundreds of employees who are dedicated to researching and finding new vulnerabilities and then weaponizing and exploiting them. And each time one of these gets found or discovered, the price keeps going up in the sort of underground exploit market. And the pitch here is perhaps best encapsulated by Shauki Bakrar, who's one of these guys that he's a sort of a marketing guru for this industry. And he says, hey, why would, if you're going to spend and invest all this time and effort in finding a bug or an exploit in the iPhone, why would you give it to Apple? You're going to get peanuts. Give it to us, and we'll give you a big bounty, not a bug bounty. So that's basically how the marketing in this in this industry works. So obviously when we have one case like this, we want to try and trace it to other cases, try and expand out our view of how this spyware is being used. So we try and do scanning for servers, internet servers associated with the spyware. So what does that mean? Well, here's how you can think of the architecture of these commercial spyware solutions. You've got, computers and phones that might be infected, and the spyware on them is programmatically exfiltrating information back through a series of cloud-based proxy servers to some government agency premises that has a, command and control server, and maybe, a bunch of dudes in a monitoring center with like 12 plasma TVs looking through the contents of your phone. But the main point here is that there's a lot of, stuff that's running out there on the internet that is potentially, has a footprint, and we can scan and fingerprint. So as an example, the link that was sent to Ahmed Mansour, when we clicked on it a second time, we got this very bizarre decoy page, which is sort of 2 meta redirects to Google. It kind of looks like someone sat out at their computer and typed this out. So it seemed like it would be a pretty good fingerprint to scan the internet for. And of course, we were able to use existing repositories like Showdown and Census and do our own sort of scanning for this as well, and enumerate other servers used in the spyware. And this is where it gets interesting, because we had this one case in the UAE, but using this methodology of scanning and fingerprinting, we found other domain names which suggested something interesting going on in Mexico.
So as this work was going on, we got contacted by one of our longstanding organizational partners in Mexico, an organization called R3D. And they said, look, we have the sense that weird things are happening to a bunch of different folks in Mexico. Journalists, activists, opposition politician groups are all saying they're getting weird messages and they think something may be going on. Let me introduce you to one such case. Javier VALDEZ was a journalist and the publisher of a small newspaper in Sinaloa called Rio Doce. And his newspaper was distinguished because it was really good at rooting out corruption and links between the Mexican government and cartels and organized crime. For his trouble, Javier VALDEZ was assassinated as he left his work in 2017. And after being dragged into the street, his mobile phone and laptop were taken from the scene, and his killers fled. Almost immediately after his death, his colleagues at Rio Doce began getting text messages. And the text messages, which of course were infection attempts, promised them information about the one thing they wanted to know the most: who had just killed their colleague and friend. But it didn't end there. Here's his fiancée, Griselda Traña, a journalist in her own right. And not long after his killing, she was also sent information, again promising information about the death of her loved one. And again, these were exploit links. When we started looking at Mexico, we discovered an absolute bucket load of targeting with Pegasus spyware. We found that every sector we could think of, from people investigating the murder and disappearance of dozens of Mexican students, to opposition politicians, to advocates for attacks on soda beverages, had all been targeted with this pretty sophisticated piece of nation-state spyware. And I would just say, watch this space for more cases like this. From that, Bill's going to talk to us a little bit about cache probing.
Thanks, John. So one other way that we can sometimes identify locations of targets or even specific victims is by using a measurement technique called DNS Cache Probing. And a lot of you might be familiar with sort of, I guess this was the first major paper that was published on it. And the idea is you send, so one idea of DNS Cache Probing is you send quote unquote non-recursive queries to caching name servers, and you see if a domain name is in the cache. So you probe for specific domains, and if the domain name is in the cache, it means someone else using that caching name server has looked it up. So if you imagine like an infected phone, infected with NSO's Pegasus spyware, it might be sending queries to its ISP's name servers, looking up a domain name for a command and control server, let's say. Sending normal recursive queries, getting responses, and then the ISP's DNS server would cache the fact that this domain was looked up with an associated TTL. So then us as researchers make the observation that, well, you can't really directly probe a lot of these ISP name servers anymore. Why? Well, some ISPs, I guess, are getting more security conscious and saying, well, look, having these open name servers is potentially bad for, DNS amplification, DDoS attacks, and things like this. So we're not going to allow people from outside the ISP to query the name servers. But it turns out that across thousands and thousands of autonomous systems on the internet, there are these devices that are DNS forwarders, and you can use these to launder your queries to the ISP's DNS servers you might not be able to query directly. They will forward, in many cases, these non-recursive queries to see if something's in the cache to the caching name server, and you get back a response, and you say, well, someone on this ISP is probably infected. So just to give you a sense that this is actually feasible and possible, you can read the full details on our Citizen Lab report called Hide and Seek. There's about 3.5 million IPv4s returning a correct response for a recursive query. About 1.7 million of them have Google in the cache, and Google here is just used as, well, if it doesn't have Google in the cache, is anyone really using this name server for anything interesting? There's about 1.2 million that appear to honor your choice to send a non-recursive query. And there's about 5,000 ASNs in sort of classified as sort of access transit ASNs, meaning likely to be ISPs, which are probable by this sort of technique. So we actually ran this for a bunch of the Pegasus domain names we found, and lo and behold, we found infections in, I don't know, I think 45 countries or something like that. And you can sort of see, worrying clusters in sort of repressive areas, and a lot of activity as well in Israel, where the company is based. In some cases, though, we can actually identify real people who are targeted just from these DNS cache probing results. So this brings us to a really interesting case of Saudi Arabia and a dissident named as Omar Abdulaziz. So we were able to filter out some of these Pegasus servers which appeared to be being used by the Saudi government to target people around the world. We found Saudi-linked DNS cache probing hits in 12 countries, including, most interestingly, on 2 ISPs in Montreal, Videotron, a home ISP, and RISC, an educational institutional ISP at universities there. And what was interesting is, when we were seeing things on Videotron, we weren't seeing them on RISC. When we were seeing them on RISC, we weren't seeing them on Videotron, suggesting a single infection. So we sought out to find Saudi dissidents in Montreal whose pattern of life matched these, movement between these ISPs at very distinctive hours. And we found one guy, Omar Abdulaziz, who was both a prominent Saudi activist whose family had been threatened and arrested, based in Montreal, but also had a very interesting explanation for why he was traveling between these 2 ISPs at odd hours, which was he would work from home during the day and go work out at the university gym in the evening, which matched our DNS cache probing results. And lo and behold, we examined his phone and found a sort of telltale text message that contained a link to a Pegasus domain, and it was posing as a DHL shipment notification. He received this right after he apparently ordered a tub of protein powder on Amazon. So he thought it was legit and remembers clicking on this link. So how do we, just taking back a step, how do we know that this is all linked to NSO group? Well, one of the things we do when we're scanning, this infrastructure over time is we monitor it for changes in behavior. Obviously, if we come out and say, hey, we detected all this NSO group infrastructure, they are going to tweak their stuff, so we, in the hope that we can't detect it. But if you look at sort of the lineage of this over time, you see significant overlaps in the infrastructure because, let's face it, if you're a company and you've got dozens of customers around the world running production systems, it's kind of hard to roll that over all at once in a way that there's no overlap. So that's definitely provides a window into continued tracking. So we published a report about the Omar Abdulaziz case on October 1 last year. October 2nd, Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And it turned out that Jamal and Omar had been working very closely together while Omar's phone was under surveillance. One of their initiatives was Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, which the Saudi government likely saw as an attempt to spark a second Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia. But it's not always this easy to detect and identify these infection attempts, and John's going to talk a bit about some problems we're encountering now.
So one of the neat things about the past few years of Citizen Lab research is that a lot of the pieces of targeting that we have been looking for are observable. They take the form of messages and links and have an element of social engineering. The problem that we are facing is that increasingly at the high end of companies selling these technologies, the companies themselves are selling techniques that are going dark. Folks are probably familiar with the reporting earlier this year about NSO's use of a vulnerability in how WhatsApp connected calls to target a bunch of folks. This is a really good example of this problem because that targeting was, of course, for the most part, unobservable both to the victims and to us. But it's not just vulnerabilities in WhatsApp that are used for no-click, no-user interaction targeting. We've also seen cases of these companies selling vulnerabilities against iMessage, the use of SS7 as a delivery modality for zero-click, no-user interaction vulnerabilities, and a lot of network injection, again used for the same technique. Put something on a device, escalate privilege, and compromise. So here's an example. The UAE government hired a group of ex-NSA spooks to develop their own cyber capability in a project that was exposed earlier this year called Project Raven. And as part of that, they rolled an iMessage vulnerability. We now know, not from any technical observations conducted by anybody publicly at the time, but because of leaks from the actual operation, that the targets included a clutch of journalists who the UAE viewed as opponents. We also know that in the case that we have reported so far, where the WhatsApp vulnerability was used, the victim was actually a lawyer whose connection we were observing. And we were observing his connection because his phone had been behaving in a really strange way. He was waking up in the middle of the night to a phone call. Now, I don't know about you, I turn off my phone at night, but he didn't. So he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd kind of groggily see like a missed call. And then he'd float back to sleep. And he'd wake up and he'd check his phone and the call log was gone. So he's getting these weird phone calls from Nordic countries in the middle of the night and then nothing. Well, we actually observed one of these weird strings of phone calls. We observed it after WhatsApp had begun silently blocking the vulnerability, and we determined that this was in fact an infection attempt. And we believe that the reason why he was getting successive calls actually points to a new TTP of these operators, which is get on, smash and grab, get as much as you can, pull logs, pull credentials, pull tokens, and then leave. And if you need more stuff, reinfect later, which of course is a smart approach, especially if you're targeting the lawyer who is representing victims of your spyware. In this case, the lawyer who prefers us not to name him is actually the lawyer representing a group of Mexicans who are victims of NSO spyware, as well as Omar Abdulaziz, a victim of NSO spyware. Pretty remarkably cowboy thing to target that person. The problem is, because of this thing, which we're sort of calling spyware going dark, it's almost impossible at this point for us to get anything like a visibility of the scale of the problem. In the cases of Mexico that we talked about before, we cast a wide dragnet over more than a year and talked to hundreds of people looking for these messages. And we were able to get, if not a complete picture, at least a picture. The problem with a lot of this no user interaction, no click stuff is that it's almost impossible for us as researchers, since we don't have any kind of global network visibility, to watch the infection process happen. Which gets us to this observation, which is the market for this kind of technology is obviously growing, but the number of cases that we know about is only inching up. The clearest example, I think, of the fact that something is wrong, which gets us to the problem of the narrowing knowledge pipe about this stuff more broadly. So we aren't the only people who are looking at these cases. The cybersecurity industry is absolutely interested in tracking these sort of sexy, interesting, zero-day based commercial spyware vendors. The problem is that even when they do publish, either privately to subscription clients or publicly, they have very little incentive to actually go tell the victims that they were targeted. There's a lot of risk, there's a lot of legal downside, they have complicated market positions, and ultimately the result is that we learn a lot from commercial players about some of these cases, but we miss real knowledge about what harm is going on and what abuses are happening. Meanwhile, major platforms who are increasingly seeing this stuff as it transits across their platforms are in kind of a tricky situation. They want to block it, which is great. They don't want to show their hand to the operators who they're blocking where possible. And wherever possible, they're trying not to add too much oxygen to the public narrative around vulnerabilities on platform. Even when they are notifying users that they may have been targets of nation-state operations, they typically don't tell the users who or what message or what vector or when or whether that thing was successful. Meanwhile, government and military also observing these cases from all sorts of different vantage points, from global network level to more local levels, and maybe some of their people are occasionally targeted with this stuff. The problem there is that for the most part, those governments really are not that interested in pointing the finger for a lot of interesting and not very surprising political reasons. It's also our observation that we think at this point that many governments actually appreciate some of the obscurity around the spyware marketplace because they want to be able to play in that space and source to it too. That may be a national security priority. The problem is it's resulting in a lot of lack of knowledge for the rest of us about what's actually happening and a lot of abuses that go largely unrecognized and unpunished. Of course, each one of these players, if you talk to them, you don't have to talk too long before they explain that it's kind of the other guy's problem. And it gets more challenging. As we're looking for zero-click, no-user interaction stuff, we as researchers have real problems with device forensics. Of course, there are lots of realities that everyone in the room is familiar with for why devices are closed the way they are. The problem is that puts us as researchers in a really difficult position when it comes to getting evidence. And the way that we have largely solved that problem in the past is to look for the targeting, because at least then we can say this person was a target. In many jurisdictions, that's already illegal, that's already a problem. But if we can't see the targeting, and it's fiendishly difficult, we can't even maybe find a JTAG port in a phone or gain access to a closed ecosystem, where are we going to find this stuff? How are we going to keep learning about it? So we're doing our best, we think, with a lot less. All right, pivoting to things that we think you can do. If you are the industry or government and you have a problem, you have an entire ecosystem presenting exciting opportunities to solve the problems, right? Vendors are full of solutions for these players. If you're in civil society, if you're a journalist, if you're an activist, if you're a member of an opposition political group, your solution is really pretty thin. Not only can you largely not afford any of that stuff, but the stuff that winds up getting tried often doesn't work. So one thing that's been tried is to do trainings and awareness raising, right? We write our reports, people talk about them. There's a simple problem though, which is that it takes almost no time for attackers to change tactics, and it takes a long time to change user behavior, right? The real talk is that behavior, at least until we arrive at the matrix, is largely unpatchable. There's also not much that users can do about zero-day attacks. We were extraordinarily lucky that the lawyer who was targeted had this vigilance and didn't just decide that he was going bananas about these late-night calls, but actually talked to us about them. Okay, so things that folks in the room can actually do. First thing first, chase the harm, right? These attacks are interesting, they're complicated, but the way that we have found out about them is not by trying to chase the most technically esoteric, interesting stuff. We're looking for cases where we can find real people who've experienced real harm. And I submit to you that that winds up getting us the bonus of some of the most interesting stuff. We get there because we work with these civil society groups, and we endeavor to communicate in ways that they understand. One of the big problems with that trifecta that I mentioned earlier is that none of those players, not industry, not platforms, not governments, are communicating about these threats in ways that anybody, except for maybe the folks in this room, can really parse. It's a little bit like trying to do public health by publishing academic papers, right? The people who know it's a problem are going to nod sagely, and the people who are getting infected with things are not even going to know where to find the journal article. Pro tip. A lot of this stuff looks boring at first. Many of the cases that we presented to you today begin by kind of boring, mundane, high human transaction cost work with targeted groups. But it is through that work, over time and with persistence, that we eventually find the interesting stuff. The way that you get there is by good two-way partnerships, because civil society groups are so heavily targeted by governments, and because governments see them as like a core part, in many cases, of their targeting blend. Interesting stuff is going to be pointed in their direction. The challenge is, as researchers, if you want to go and work with those groups, it's extremely important to be fair and be mindful of reciprocity. Now, getting a little bit more concrete here, we actually think that there are researchers, including at USENIX, who are doing awesome work on this problem set. Rosner and McGregor are doing amazing work on the kinds of risks that journalists and others face. And we think that there's a huge opportunity space for more exciting and engaging work exactly like this, that you can deploy based on the skill sets that you have, right? So you want to volunteer, right? Maybe you don't want to do this as academic research, maybe you want to do this in a more mundane way. This is also eminently possible, but part of the challenge that goes through anybody's head when they think about volunteering is, my God, I don't necessarily have a lot of time. How do I interact with these groups, right? Maybe I do social things in software rather than hardware. How am I going to have these relationships? Well, the good news is there are plenty of intermediary groups who, if you're interested in this kind of thing, are interested in you. Furthermore, there are lots of ways to accommodate that within your existing professional responsibilities, whether it's your equivalent of 20% time or other kinds of volunteer work. And finally, it's possible, if you're a company and you're a vendor, to provide direct support to these groups in a way that's meaningful. If this kind of thing interests you, Bill and I will be hanging out up here. We've got stickers and we've got recommendations if you want to go talk to specific people. Finally, Bill's going to talk about one other thing here.
Yeah, so some of you might have heard of this initiative we have at Berkeley called Citizen Clinic. So it's sort of, I guess, a practical counterpart, practitioner counterpart to Citizen Lab. So rather than doing super hardcore academic research or really technical stuff, Citizen Clinic is sort of takes a page from the legal clinic model and tries to get advanced undergraduate and masters and PhD students involved directly in providing cybersecurity advice, capacity building, the sort of quote unquote boring stuff, like helping under-resourced organizations set up 2FA, do a device audit of their network, basically the sort of basic stuff that they simply don't have the capacity or the money to go out and pay someone else to do. And the hope is that also this will sort of build a talent pipeline going into industry, going into academia, of people who have experience working with and building trust with these sorts of groups, and can then go and sort of influence their future careers or future academic pursuits to try and get more more focus both in industry and academia on this topic. As an academic in computer science who works on this topic, it is somewhat frustrating, I have to say, that it's sometimes kind of challenging to get traditional sources of academic research funding in computer science to focus on this work. The sort of things that we present are sort of very interesting case studies that many people would, I'm sure, love to read about in magazines or blogs. But I think it's important as well to remember that the part of the cycle of uncovering these new cases and uncovering these new techniques and shining a light on this growing new problem space is absolutely applying rigorous technical methods from the academic community to this sort of problem. And I think there's a lot of interesting research to be done and to be funded here in computer science as well. With that, I guess we'll conclude and thank a bunch of people that helped us out, including one of the things as a target, you have to imagine it's very, very tough to make the decision to go public. What if people say, oh, this person's hacked, we'll never trust them again. So there's definitely risks to going public, potential retaliation from the government. Also the NGOs that helped us investigate a lot of these cases, R3D, Social Teak, Article 19, and our awesome collaborators and colleagues at Citizen Lab and at ICSI. Yeah, I think we'll be happy to take any questions.
Great. So we've got a lot of time for questions, and I'm going to start off with one so that while people are lining up the microphone. So how do we actually fix this? Awareness is a great start. Turning to the governments to fix it, you've explained they're uninterested in fixing it. Let the market decide, doesn't seem like it's working. What does the tipping point look like? So we do a lot of awareness, we get a lot of people volunteering in civil society. What does it look like when we're actually starting to fix it?
Yeah, so there's, I think, sort of the unfortunate status quo of where we are right now is that, a lot of this, in terms of raising awareness about this stuff and providing the ammunition for advocacy efforts, is basically our research and the research of others who work in this space. And we've seen attempts both on sort of attempts from civil society to push for greater government regulation on these companies in terms of export controls, to push for the people who are funneling money into these industries to perhaps be more cautious about funding these sorts of companies, because let's face it, they are kind of risky investments. If you send one text to Ahmed Mansour, one missed call to a lawyer, and suddenly your whole stack of exploits gets burned. So I think that's sort of the status quo. I think it would be there sort of needs to be a response from sort of all quarters of society. It's not just like a tech and government response. It's not purely an investor response. I think, the philosophy that I always try and articulate is it's sort of about mapping out the different actors in this space and trying to convince each actor, let's say investors, let's say government, let's say the companies, let's say the governments, that it's in their interest to not employ these technologies to target civil society, because if they get caught and their stuff gets disclosed, it's bad for everyone. There's big monetary costs. There's costs like, if the UAE government screws up and the MI5 or something is also using this, then their capability is gone too because the exploits were patched in the UAE. It's sort of thinking about trying to convince each of these players that there is a lot of risk associated with this behavior and try and convince them to sort of rein it in. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, but great answer. I think we should turn to some of the growing line of questions here.
Okay. So there are a number of notorious hacking groups out there that sell their wares all throughout the world. Your presentation focused mostly on NSO. And I was wondering, is it particularly egregious in the conduct you've seen, or is it just where you spent your time? Or
I think the simplest answer to that is that we've spent a lot of time looking at targeted malware players. And part of what we are probably picking up on is NSO's growing market dominance. A couple of years ago, we were maybe looking at Hacking Team and FinFisher in some of these countries. Now we're seeing a lot more of this particular player. To me, that's partly a market reality. It's partly also the case that when we looked at some initial NSO stuff, right, we started looking at cases, and pretty soon we found more cases. And pretty soon lawyers representing the victims of the first cases got targeted again. So I think we're kind of in an interesting situation. What I would say, though, is that the industry is large and much larger than the research that we've got. And the thing that frankly, the thing that drives me bananas is that there aren't more researchers looking at this. And as a result, the public narratives end up attaching themselves to the most salient players. And there's a little bit of an arc, right? Like typically when we originally find a case, like whether it's Hacking Team or FinFisher or what have you, the company will sort of start by denying, and then they'll be like, wait a minute, we'd like to sell our story to the press, and then they start doing that, and that spectacularly backfires, and they get a lot of attention. NSO is clearly in somewhere along the spectacular backfiring of PR strategy arc, but there are other players out there that we don't see. And the unfortunate reality is that policymakers and others don't even know what those players are as well, and so the narrative and the process gets a bit skewed. But thanks for your question.
Hello, my name is Bobo. I'm
Hello,
from
Bobo.
Facebook. Hi. I've spent the last year working on attempting to prevent the use of Facebook to incite mass violence. That's been a very challenging space to work in. I'm hugely appreciative of the work that you guys do, and I know that it's also a challenging space to work in. I've become more curious about some of the targeted instances of violence or surveillance, such as the stuff that you guys work on. And I wanted to ask a somewhat naive question around discoverability in sort of two ways. I'm wondering, like, okay, people who are selling these exploits need to be discoverable by the people who would like to purchase them. The first half of your presentation looked at some of that. So I'm wondering what the total cost is to put up shell companies or fronts that look governmental and simply buy these things. And then on the other side, people who would wish to report alleged surveillance to a good actor like you also face a discoverability challenge. They need to become aware that you exist. There may be language issues. There may be simple access issues. And then they need some way to communicate with you. So I'm curious how you monitor, measure, or attempt to mitigate bad actors posing as you. So discoverability on both sides.
That's an interesting compound question. Didn't sound naive to me at all. But the first part of it was a question, why don't people do these other things? Why don't they create fronts and shells? Here's, I think, one way to look at this. There's been an arms industry for a long time. And it's a bunch of people who know each other. And they have lots of ways of operating in grays. And almost all of it is based on trust and relationships and brokers. And I think that this industry doesn't just borrow tactics from that industry. It is that industry. It is an arms industry.
When you say arms right now, you mean physical arms?
That's correct, yeah. So the physical arms industry has existed for decades. And in many ways, I think the place that we have gotten to with a lot of this spyware looks really similar. It's even sold at the same industry events. So I think it's challenging. I think it would be challenging for anybody who wished to insert themselves and get meaningful information from all but the dumb players who didn't have enough capital or relationships to avoid, sort of an easy trap. To the second question, sort of people impersonating us, let me turn that around a little bit and say, we have actually been targeted as the lab. So in the last year, Black Cube, a spy company with a bunch of ex-Mossad folks, was hired to target my colleague Bahar and myself. And we turned the tables on them and exposed them at a restaurant in New York and brought along a camera team. But we're kind of in an interesting position right now. We have these great metrics of success, right? They send spies after you. But I think more generally, as researchers, we benefit from the credibility of our academic freedom and from our position. But we're also now bumping up against really powerful interests with real resources. And I think what would help us the most is for there to be a depth of other researchers who are also working on this case so that nobody would think, man, if we just sort of, discredited a couple of these guys from Citizen Lab, maybe we'd, solve the problem. But thanks for your question. I want to make sure that I get to other people too.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rosberg from Yukon. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, important work. And I have a question actually following on Roger's question. It is very important technical work trying to help people and so on, but can't we, as an industry, as experts, do something like similar to what happened by atomic researchers to promote arms control? Because this is really something where we as a technical society may be the entity that could help to move the general public by collecting together and promoting this to the general public, explaining this non-trivial situation. So yeah, that's the question.
Really good question. So on the topic of arms control, since we're there, if you look at the drivers of arms control, and let's not talk about nuclear weapons for a second, but let's talk about the control of smaller weapons, right? The most destabilizing thing that happened in the past few decades, arguably, was the end of the Soviet Union and the movement of millions upon millions of Kalashnikovs, RPGs, and small weapons from former Soviet satellite states into Africa and into other regions of conflict, right? Those are weapons that will last decades, and they create a big problem. The reason why arms control frameworks were partly developed is because nations with power saw this as a destabilizing thing that they couldn't ignore. Unfortunately, I think right now, we're at such a low level of knowledge about the impact of many of these threats, including on governments and others, that they don't really feel that imperative very strongly. And many of the governments that would be the best players at this have domestic industries selling this stuff that they would really rather not see regulated. I would love to see meaningful regulation like that. I'm just not sure how we get there without a lot more knowledge about the case. Did you want to add anything, Bill?
I mean, the only thing I'll add is, it's much harder to prevent the export of a piece of code than, like a nuclear weapon. Like, there's less physical stuff that you can, like everyone knows how to build nuclear weapons. There's books you can buy on Amazon how to build a nuclear weapon. The problem is getting the physical stuff. And I think it's much harder to prevent the spread of knowledge and expertise and, skill sharing and consulting and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, okay, I just beg to differ on two things. First, yes, it is harder to control the proliferation, but regulations, agreement could limit this kind of open market. And that would have been a huge difference. I mean, that would have prevented such companies from becoming big corporations, okay? So I think that arms control can be effective, not 100%, but can be very effective. And the other thing is, yes, I agree that the problem of small weapons arm control is very important, but I do think that what we should be looking for is something actually more similar to, nuclear weapons and so on. And these are things where we could get the public opinion moving. That is what happened with, with nuclear weapons by scientists. And I think that's something to think about. That's all. Thank you.
Totally agree with you. I think the challenge is how do we get to a place of consensus around the need for that? Thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Super fascinating perspective and great material. Thanks a lot. And very important work, of course. I'm more of a curiosity than anything else. In the research domain, at least, there is a lot of momentum being gained by methods for attacker deception. And I wonder how that would apply, if it applies at all, if it's even in scope of your operations, given the kind of adversaries you guys have.
Do you want to define attacker deception for us?
Oh, like, pretending that the attack worked and making them lose a lot of time, or giving them false information that kind of, deceives them.
Well, it's certainly the case that, there are a lot of impacts of these attacks beyond the actual success of the attack. The sort of chilling effect or the sort of
time, or giving them false information that kind of, deceives them.
Well, it's certainly the case that, there are a lot of impacts of these attacks beyond the actual success of the attack. The sort of chilling effect or the sort of, fear we all live with. Oh my God, like I'm compromised all the time. There's nothing I can do. There's no steps I can take to prevent myself from becoming a target of this. And unfortunately, for the really, sexy 0-day, 0-click stuff, that's probably true. But in fact, for the vast majority of people, it's because it's based on cost, right? How important are you? How expensive do you feel like? How much is the private information that you have worth to the government? How much are they willing to spend to compromise you? So for the average person, I think even for the sort of mid-range dissident, there are a lot of things that they can do, and this is where things like training and awareness raising and stuff like that can help a bit. Yeah.
Thanks for your question, though.
Hi, yeah, I'd like to ask, aren't there any agents or countermeasures you can install on a device that could at least detect if you've been attacked by one of these systems?
Wouldn't that be great? I think, but like just in practice, just to keep it in your mind, when this technology is sold, much of it comes with a little sheet guaranteeing non-detection, right? It's like the equivalent of like the 0 detections on VirusTotal, right? Like guaranteed not to be detected by like McAfee Enterprise and Norton and stuff like that. I think the answer is, right, at the high level, this stuff is pretty sophisticated and they'll profile their target pretty well before they do it. It would be great if there were more on-device things that could be done. I think that's, a hard to solve problem in general. Thanks though. Next question.
Hi, Megan DeBloy with Inner News, and I know we work with a lot of the same groups. Right now we have a project that's focused on building the capacity of civil society groups, the first responder communities that are interacting with a lot of these end users that are targeted. And there are a lot of reasons why right now there's a huge lack of skill within that community to actually be doing this research to protect their own. And that's from lack of opportunities, lack of resources, and we're trying to address those particular things. But given that Citizen Lab has been doing this for a long time, what are your thoughts around how to scale skill among civil society and first responders? Because they weren't mentioned kind of in those key stakeholders that are doing security research right now, but how can we get it so they build up a capacity and skill set to do so?
this is an awesome problem, right? It's a great question. I think what we have found is that it happens through experience, right? In the same way that trust is transactional, experience over time with targeting makes civil society groups a lot better at this. And my favorite example of this is the Tibetan diaspora, which has just been targeted since it existed with different forms of electronic monitoring. And after like decades of this kind of problem, they figured out pretty clever ways to do their own security. They have a cert, TIB cert, for example. But I just have to tell this story. They were thinking, okay, so go back about 10 years, and one of the biggest challenges they faced was emails with attachments containing malware. So they're like, how do we solve this problem? Everybody's sending everybody else attachments. How do we deal with this? And they came up with a quite novel solution, which was a very Buddhist solution, which was a campaign called Detach from Attachments. And it worked until the attackers, after like a year or two, figured it out and started masquerading as Google Drive links, which is where they had pivoted. But I think it's absolutely possible for civil society groups to work better. In practice, it often requires these deep partnerships with researchers and others so that at least at the beginning they can get information about what they're working for. I think we can safely say now, for example, civil society in Mexico is like not to be trifled with, given how much time they've just spent looking for Pegasus stuff. But great question. Nick Weaver.
I could ask a silly question, but I'm going to ask a serious one.
Allegedly.
One thing is this stuff is usable for and used for real investigations, etc., of actual criminals. And when it is misused by an actor and it ends up on Bill's desk, that has a bad fate-sharing effect for the true law enforcement. So the question is, how much for the stuff you've investigated do you see stuff that really does look like just criminal investigations? And are you starting to see the market split due to the damage you get when you fate share with somebody who sells to bad actors?
Fantastic question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's not really too much evidence yet for a market split. I mean, we've seen in our most recent, DNS Cache Probing stuff of NSO Group, we see, usage by usage by governments where it looks like, you really wouldn't expect abuse, like the Swiss government, for instance, or perhaps, maybe the Singaporean government or other cases like that. So I think. I'm not sure if those governments have sort of really gotten the message that fate sharing is bad. On the other hand, though, our methodology, because we're in contact with civil society targets, we cannot, in most of the time, we cannot produce findings of like, oh, a criminal was targeted with spyware, because we're just not in touch with them. We don't really have the desire or the means to get in touch with them. But every now and then we do come across cases, like if we're looking for, I don't know, files on VirusTotal, we'll see, oh, look, there's this sample of FinFisher that, looks like it's, related to a law enforcement thing, or, oh, there's this target who tweeted about something that, oh, that person looks like they're, perhaps, someone who you'd want to perhaps be under surveillance. So I'm not sure that they've really figured out the fate sharing. The sort of converse to the fate sharing is that once you have the sort of critical mass of employees, like let's say 600 employees at NSO Group, well, I don't know, like how many people are there out there in the world which have the expertise, the capability, and the experience to like find vulnerabilities in iPhones and Androids. Like if you hire up the whole market and corner the market, maybe there's really no other solutions for them to turn to. But I don't know. We'll see as time goes on and if we have any new insights there.
Yeah, and I mean, just to build on what Bill says, I think for the same reason that a lot of countries purchase this stuff because they can't develop it, there's also a lot of information externality. They don't really know what they're getting, right? They don't even know whether their activities with this technology are monitored by the governments whose jurisdictions the companies that sell this spyware exist in, right? So there's a big information problem. And I think that is probably one of the things preventing feedback from going back to customers, right? There's a lot they don't know. Great question, Nick.
Hey, my name is Swapnil, and this is a great presentation. I was just curious, how often do you get targeted by different governments while doing this work? And I mean, even doing this work, I'm not even sure if there are any laws to protect you guys. Like, how do you deal with that?
I mean, it's a tough problem set, right? And I think the evolution that we've probably both experienced is we've spent a lot of time understanding the risks to others. And in more recent years, we're learning a lot about how it feels to also consider that some of those risks might be pointed at us for what we do. Do we have time for one more question, Roger? Or are we?
I'm going to cut it off there because people are getting antsy. Thank you again for an amazing talk. And
thanks so much, everyone.